In this tutorial, we're going to learn to make this cabled scarf called Windy, which is a design by Storey. You can buy the pattern on Ravelry, and I've included a link to the pattern so you can easily do that below. So if you're confident with both the knit and purl stitches and you've already tried some simple cables, then this is a really good pattern for you. And I'm going to show you very slowly first how to cable with a cable needle and then how to cable without a cable needle. And this pattern is a great way to learn these techniques because the rows are very short and there's a lot of repeats. So by the time you finish the scarf, you would have done a lot of practice and you'll be an expert. So I'm using the Rowan Pure Wool Worsted, which comes in a fantastic range of beautiful colours, and I'm using electric and light denim, and I've provided a link below so you can check out this yarn as well. So get a copy of your pattern and get your yarn, and I'll see you in the next section where we'll be casting on together. I always like to recommend making a gauge before starting your project. It's less important when making an accessory like a scarf than a garment which needs to fit exactly, but it is a good opportunity to practice the pattern so that when you do come to knitting your scarf, the scarf is bound to be a lot neater. So the stitch gauge is more important to get right than the row gauge. The stitch gauge is what's going to give you the correct width, and the row gauge is what will give you the correct length. Now obviously you can keep knitting to the length required on a scarf, so that's not so important. But if your stitch gauge is too wide, for example, then you might find that the cables will end up being a little bit sloppy looking and the sides of the scarf in this garter stitch will look too loose. So the gauge in the pattern says to measure 30 stitches of pattern, and that has to be 10 centimetres. Now the scarf only uses a few more stitches than 30, so I recommend casting on the required amount of stitches and knitting a section of the scarf and testing your gauge on that. So the scarf is meant to be exactly 16 centimetres wide. If I measure my scarf, it's exactly 16 centimetres wide. Okay, now I know that I'm a tight knitter, so if you're a loose knitter, you might actually want to start off testing your gauge swatch on a half a size needle smaller. So instead of the recommended 4.5 millimetre, you might want to try 4 millimetres to start off with. So this scarf is a very clever design. It's a canvas of garter stitch on the back and these beautiful cables on the front, which give it a lovely 3D effect. So what's important when knitting this is that the cables will really pop out. And garter stitch, and just to remind you, garter stitches just simply means knitting on the right and the wrong side, is always going to be a bit of a looser fabric. So we do want, these are two reasons why you might want to try knitting a little bit tighter than you normally do. So starting off with a smaller size needle. We do want these cables to pop out. So you have two colours in this pattern, yarn A and yarn B. Yarn A is what you'll be knitting the cables in, that's your main colour, and yarn B is the contrast colour that you'll see in stripes in the background. So I am doing it reverse to the pattern. I'm making my dark colour yarn A. So in the rows of knitting in the contrast colour, which is in my case the light colour, and yarn B, you slip the cable stitches onto the right-hand needle without knitting them. So the cabled stitches are only knitted together when you're using yarn A. So I will show you that in great detail. We're also going to start off using a cable needle, and I will show you, for those of you who have never done cabling before, how to use a cable needle. And when you're confident with that, I'm then going to show you how to knit cables without a cabling needle. We're going to cast on the required amount of stitches in yarn A, and we're going to use the long tail method. I've cast on nearly all of my stitches. I'll show you now quickly how to do the long tail method, but if you'd like to see a slower version of this, I'll include a link in the program notes to an instructional video. So this is the tail end, and this is the end that is attached to our ball of wool. So we wrap the tail end, we hold it like this in our hands, we put our thumb over the top and down and around like this. And then we put the needle up through here. We can pinch the needle to hold it, and we simply knit it. And then put this loop over the top of the end, and we pull on the tail end. I'll show you again. So put our thumb over the top of the yarn, down and around, put the needle up here. We can just hold the needle and then put our working yarn under anti-clockwise, so from right to left. We've got a loop over our thumb, and we just pass that over the top of the needle, and we always pull with the tail end. If we pull with the working yarn end, the stitches will be too tight. Okay, so now we've cast on the correct amount of stitches that we need for the pattern in yarn A, and we're immediately going to bring in our yarn B to start the first row. And this first row will be the right side of the scarf. So we leave a bit of a tail, which we're going to darn in later. I just hold it between my fingers in my left hand. And we start, and we're told to knit 3. Now it says to slip 3 WYAB, which means with yarn at back. So we're starting immediately establishing where our cables are going to be. I'll put this back here so you can see it. So we're immediately going to establish these cables here. So we won't knit these stitches, and we don't want to have floats coming from the contrast colour at the front of the work. So it means that we carry this yarn behind our stitches, and we're going to slip the next 3 stitches from the left hand needle onto the right hand needle, and we're going to do it purlwise. That just means putting the tip of the needle from the right to the left like that. If we were to slip it knitwise, we would be slipping it from left to right up like this. That's how to slip a stitch knitwise. But we want to slip it purlwise, so from right to left, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and we have with yarn at back. It means that the yarn, our contrast colour yarn B, is at the back of the work, and it stays there. Okay, now we need to knit 7. Now, immediately I'm going to tell you that we want these cable stitches to pop out. So we want to make this stitch here in the contrast colour and the next stitch as close together as possible. This bar of wool across here in stranded knitting is what we call a float. And in stranded knitting, we like to have it just nice and loose so that the fabric stays really stretchy and even between all of these stitches. But we don't want that. We want our cable to pop out. So we actually want this float to be very tight. So this is the first little trick you need to do, is to make sure that this stitch and this stitch after the ones before the 3 cable stitches are pulled tightly together. Then I need to slip again the next 3 stitches, which will be this cable pattern here, purlwise onto my right hand needle so we don't knit these stitches, and my contrast yarn is held at the back. And then I knit again, and I'm going to make sure that this stitch is tightly joined to this stitch. So I pull it tight, and that's going to make the cables pop. Again, I slip the next 3 purlwise, and I knit 7. So again, each contrasting colour stitch is pulled tight on either side of the cables. I knit normally in between 2, 4, 6, 7, and I'm ready again for my next cable panel. So I slip 3 and knit the next one really tight. You can see how tight I'm pulling it. So that's our row 1, and we've immediately established where the cable panels are going to be. So we turn around. This is now going to be the back side of the scarf. I'm going to quickly show you the back side of the scarf here. This is what we're going to be working back along. We're simply going to garter stitch all of the yarn B colours, and then I'm up to my cable panel, and I still don't knit them. We don't want to carry our yarn this way like we did on the previous row, because it'll create a float on the right side of the fabric. So we put the yarn underneath the needle as if we were going to purl, and we just we slip the next 3 stitches purlwise onto the right hand needle like this, and carry it behind. See, that's where we carried it behind on the previous row. We carry it behind, and again we want to make this tight, this stitch and this stitch close together. So I knit the next stitch and I pull it tight. Okay, then I knit normally all of the yarn B stitches, and again WYAF with yarn at front. And remember, don't pull it straight over the top of the needle, because you'll create a stitch. It has to go underneath the needle and at the front of the work as if you're going to purl, and then slip the next 3 stitches purlwise, so from right to left onto your needle. Put the yarn back underneath the right hand needle, knit this 1 stitch tightly because we want to make the cables pop. Now we've got another 3 cable stitches, so we need to bring the yarn back under the needle so it's at the front with yarn at front. Pass the cable stitches from right to left purlwise, bring the yarn back underneath again to the back side of the fabric and knit. And again, remember, each stitch of contrast in colour on either side of the cable panel has to be pulled tight. And then I knit normally on to the next lot. Okay, good. So we're here. You can pull these tail ends a little bit to keep them tight. So we've just done the first 2 rows of the pattern. We're up to row 3 now, and it's going to get really exciting because we're going to start with the cabling. So first of all, make sure you've got yourself a cable needle. This is what one looks like. And before we start, I'm going to just briefly explain to you what we're going to be doing. If you understand how we're moving the stitches around, it's going to look and feel a lot less traumatic. Okay, so this is what we call our cabling panel, these 3 dark stitches from yarn A. And we're going to be moving them either to the left or to the right. So in your pattern, when you have CR4L, the L stands for left, and that means you'll be moving these cabling stitches to the left. And when you've got CR4R, the R stands for right, and you'll be moving the cabling stitches, the whole 3 of them, to the right. So we're only going to be moving them to the left or to the right over 1 stitch of the contrasting colour being B. So you can see here I've got 3 stitches from the contrasting colour, and then I've got my 3 cabling panel, and then I'm going to move this stitch here, this contrasting stitch, behind, and it's going to end up on this side of the cabling stitches. So I'll then have 4 stitches here, and I'll have 1 stitch less in this section of the contrasting colour. And when I come here, I'm going to move these 3 stitches inwards to the right, and this stitch here, this contrast colour yarn B stitch, will be moved behind the 3 and it'll end up here. So we're just switching our stitches around. Row 3, and we've got both of our yarns here. That's yarn A and that's yarn B. We're going to be using yarn A. So I put my needle in and we're going to start knitting the first 3 stitches. And I'm going to always pull the first stitch tight. If you have a look here, we want this side edge to be firm. So I pull it really tight. And then 2, and then 3. So now I'm up to CR4L, meaning left. So I have to move these 3 stitches left. So what I do is I take my cable needle and I slip these stitches purlwise that we've done just before, so from right to left. 1, 2, 3. And I leave them at the front of the work. I'm just going to leave them hanging there. And I'm going to move this stitch here behind. And I'm going to knit this stitch before I knit these stitches. And that'll move it to the right of the cabled. Now, I also want these 2 stitches to sit closely together. So I'll knit this stitch here and keep it tight. Okay, so now I've got 4 stitches on my right hand needle, and then I want to knit these stitches back onto the right hand needle. So I now hold them in the left hand, make sure the cable needle doesn't fall out, and I knit them. 1, 2, whoopsie, split my wool, 2 and 3. And we've done our first cable, yay! So now we've got to knit to our next cable. And then we have a CR4R, and the R means move the cable stitches, these 3 stitches to the right. So we need to put this contrast stitch around here. So what we do is we get our cable needle, we slip it purlwise onto this needle, and we hold it at the back of the fabric, because if we were to hold it at the front, it would end up passing across the front of the cables, and that wouldn't look good. So we hold it at the back of the needle, at the back of the work. Just leave it there. And now we're going to knit these 3 cables, these 3 cable stitches, and we've moved them across. And here's our contrast stitch, and we're going to slide it to the end of the cable needle, and we're going to knit it. And we've done our second cabling. And so this cable has been moved 1 stitch there, and we've got an extra stitch on the other side. We've got fewer stitches in between because this cable panel has also been moved to the right. So now we knit 1, and we're going to be moving these 3 to the left. So we put them on our cable needle and we leave them at the front, and we knit the contrast stitch and move it over, and then we need to slide these cable stitches to the end and knit them back onto the right hand needle. And we've done our next cabling. And our last cable needle, a cable panel, we want to move to the right. So we stop 1 contrast stitch beforehand because we want that stitch to end up on the left hand side. And slip it onto the cable needle, hold it at the back, knit the 3 stitches on the cable needle, knit the 3 cable stitches, and then knit the 1 stitch off the cable needle and the last 3 stitches. So that's your first cabling row. Well done. We're now up to row 4, and that'll be on the back side of the fabric. So if you're looking at the pattern again, the background is knitted in garter stitch, but the cable panels are actually in stocking stitch. So that means that the cable panelled stitches on the back side of the fabric we need to purl so that it creates the stocking stitch. But the in-between background stitches we need to keep in garter stitch, and that means we need to knit them. So that's exactly what we're doing on the back side of the fabric. You can see from the row underneath where the contrast colour is and where the cabled panels are here. So you're going to, whenever you see from right to left the contrast, in my case it's a lighter shade, we're going to be knitting those stitches, and then these 3 where the row below going right to left like a purl stitch is in the same yarn A, we're going to purl those because that's the cabled the pattern. So you can just go along the stitches and see which ones you need to knit and which ones you need to purl. Okay, so now you can see I'm up to my 3 stitches of cabling, and they need to be purled. So I put my working yarn underneath the needle to the front of the fabric and purl these 3 stitches. Oops, I split my wool again. Okay, so I've purled those 3 and I put my working yarn back to the front. Now here you don't need to pull any of the stitches tight, just pull the first and the last one tight to keep the edges neat. So I continue to knit on all the stitches that have got that contrasting purl stitch in the previous row, and now I'm up to my 3 cable stitches. So I put my working yarn underneath the needle to the front of the work and purl those 3. So you'll find that all of these backside rows are pretty easy to follow. You can see that my working yarn A and yarn B is always going to be on the same side, and I will carry them up this side. So you'll have no ends to weave in, and that's a great thing. So you'll be knitting forwards and backwards on yarn A, and then yarn B will come up, and forwards and backwards, and keeping alternating. So what's really important here is that you pull these yarns quite tight. You need to just continue with the pattern, reading the CR4L or CR4R as the pattern says, moving the cables in until we get to the first crossover, and then I will show you that. But there's one more little trick I want to show you, and that is quite often what happens when you have a panel of cable stitches, and I've left it here so that you can see, is that your third knit stitch in a row will be quite loose. Quite naturally it'll be loose and sloppy. Okay, and that doesn't look very good. You can see that there. So even though I've been knitting tightly, and it'll always end up that the third knit stitch before you change is going to be sloppy. So what you do is you knit into the back loop of the third stitch. So you make it like a twisted knit stitch, and that'll tighten it up a bit and makes it neater. And I've done that as I've got up further, and you can see that it's neater. It also helps to give it this 3D poppy effect. And then coming back, when you're purling, you can purl into the back loop. So you're making both stitches on both sides smaller. I'll show you what I mean by that now. To knit, I knit through the front loop. That's knitting through the front loop. So this side is the front loop, that side is the back loop. So a normal knit stitch, you knit through the front loop like that. Now, if you want to knit through the back loop like that, it's simply going to twist it around a bit and make it a bit tighter. So I'll do that. That'll make that stitch a bit tighter. I always do the middle stitch normally, and then this stitch here, which is also quite loose, instead of knitting it through the front loop, I knit it through the back loop, and that'll twist it and tighten it up. Move these stitches left. So I put them on my cable needle, and you can already see on the cable needle, you can also see that that's quite a sloppy stitch there too. So if you see your stitches on the cable needle and it looks a bit sloppy, do a twisted knit stitch. I leave it at the front, I move that over, and now to knit, I knit through the front loop. That's knitting through the front loop. So this side is the front loop, that side is the back loop. So a normal knit stitch, you knit through the front loop like that. Now, if you want to knit through the back loop like that, it's simply going to twist it around a bit and make it a bit tighter. So I'll do that. That'll make that stitch a bit tight. So that's a little trick to do to tighten up the outside edges of each cable panel. It's called C7B, and it just means we're cabling with 7 stitches, and we're going to put the first lot of stitches behind, therefore the B. So we slip the first 4 stitches purlwise onto our cable needle, and we leave those stitches behind at the back of the work, like that. Then we're going to knit these 3. And remember, you have the option, if you want to, of knitting into the back loop of the first and the third stitch, just to make those cables pop out. Okay, so that's what I've done. And already you can see this column is crossing over the top of that column. So there it is there. If we go back and have a look what's on our cable stitch, there is our contrast stitch, which is going to end up in the middle. Okay, so we're going to have this panel is crossing this panel, but we have to get this contrast stitch here to be once more in between and sit here. So that's what we do now. We take the contrast stitch from the cable needle and we put it back, slipping it back purlwise, like that, onto the left-hand needle. And now we're going to move these 3 cable stitches to the front of the work, like this. Okay, so there they are there. That's this panel going behind and up through here, and that's this front panel going there. And now, if we were to knit our contrast stitch, it ends up being, as you can see here, again in the middle of our 2 columns of cable stitches, which is exactly where we want it. So now, and this is still at the front of the work, we're ready to knit these 3 stitches. And I'm going to knit through the back loop on the first stitch. I knit normally on the second stitch, and through the back loop of the third stitch, and there we've done it. We've rearranged all our stitches like magic. This cable panel now travels underneath, and there are those 3 stitches. The contrast stitch, and if I pull it right apart like this, you can see there's the contrast stitch in the previous row, and it's now in between those 3 panels and there. So that's how you do it. It's your first crossover. So I knit all the in-between ones. I'll go through this a little bit faster. So we want this panel to go behind all the others. So I slip purlwise the first 4 stitches onto the cable needle, put them to the back of the work out of the way, knit these 3 stitches. So that brings this panel across that panel. Have a look at my stitches on my cable needle. Slip the contrast stitch to the left, and then I bring these 3 stitches around to the front like that. I knit the contrast stitch, and then I scoot these stitches to the end of my cable needle and I knit them on. And as I've told you many times, I'm knitting into the back loop of the first and the third stitches so that they pop out. Okay, so that's row 15, the difficult row, and that's what it looks like. I'm going to quickly show you the back row. It's pretty simple. You'll just be knitting the background. Remember, always pulling your first stitch tight. Okay, so here we are. We've got our first 3 stitches of the cable panel. So I purl through the back loop of the first. The second one I purl normally. Purl through the back loop of the third stitch. Now here's my contrast stitch. See it? There it is there. So I want to put the yarn back around to the back of the material so I can knit this stitch, because that is the background. That's a garter. So we're going to garter stitch that, and then we bring this back around to the front, and we're going to purl this panel of cable stitches. So through the back loop of the first and the third, and then back around here. So that's what you do with those 7 stitches that you cabled on the other side. This is the 16th row. So first of all, you're told in yarn A to knit 13 stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13. I've done that. So here we are. And we're going to move these 3 over the top of those 3, keeping that contrast in the middle. So this is a little tricky. We take the first 3 stitches purlwise onto our cable needle, and we leave it at the front. We leave it at the front because we know we want to cross it over at the front. Okay, then we're going to slip this contrast stitch out of our way, and so we're going to slip it purlwise onto our right hand needle. And then we're going to slip the remaining 3 cable stitches onto the cable needle and have them at the front. So now we've got the 6 cable stitches on the cable needle together at the front. And we've got that one contrast stitch which belonged in between them on our right hand needle. And we're now going to move it to our left hand needle, purlwise. Okay, so as you can see, we want these 3 there, we want these 3 over the top and this one in the middle. So that's what we're going to do. So we now slip those 3 back onto the left hand side, and what we've done is we've got this panel still in front. What we've basically done just by that maneuver is taken our contrast stitch and moved it behind the second lot of 3 cable stitches, and there it is there. Okay, so now we're ready to knit, and I'm knitting on the first and the third through the back loop. These 3 cable stitches. Okay, and you can see that's pulling them behind, and if we cross those over, we'll have them in front, and we want our contrast stitch in the middle. So now the next thing we do is we knit the contrast stitch, and then we bring these cable stitches over the front like this, and I knit through the back loop of the first, second is normal, and through the back loop of the third. Okay, so now we've done it, we've achieved it. So this panel is crossing over the left hand panel, and we have our contrast stitch, there it is, the row below you can see, in the middle. That's your 31st row. Continue and practice using your cable needle, and then if you're feeling game, I'm going to show you how to do all of those cables without a cable needle. So hopefully you've been finding that cabling okay, and you've been getting quite used to understanding how you're moving your panels of cable stitches around, and you're ready now and excited to try cabling without a cable needle. The advantages of it is that once you understand it, you can work a lot faster, because every time you're picking up something and putting it down, it takes up time, and it interrupts the flow of knitting. So once you've learnt this, I think you'll find that it's a lot more pleasurable to do cables. I'm going to show you a row 3 again. So here we are, we're going to be moving this panel 1 stitch across, this panel 1 stitch to the right, this panel 1 stitch to the left, etc. Our working yarn is to the back. What we're going to do is slip these 3 stitches onto our right hand needle purlwise. There we go, we've done that. Our working yarn is still at the back, and now we're going to knit this stitch. Okay, so we've got a float from there to there. And we want it, we've got these 3 stitches here, which are our cable stitches, and that was our contrast stitch, and we want to move them over here. So we take the point of our left hand needle and we slide it from left to right here like that. And now don't hold this, let go of this wool or let it be loose. And we're going to pull our stitch, our right hand needle out like this, and then back in there, like that. And there we are. And now we want to have those 2 tight together, so we pull our needle, and then we just simply knit these across. And as usual, I knit through the back stitch of the first and the third. Okay, so you have to understand logically what you're doing. We're going to move this stitch here around behind our cable panel, and it's going to end up there. Okay, so this is a little bit more tricky. You take your working yarn, you put it underneath your needle as if you were going to knit, as if you're going to purl. So it's at the front of the work. Now we slip this contrast stitch onto our right hand needle, like that, purlwise. Now we're going to take the working yarn around the front and to the back, just like that, so that it's ready in the proper position to knit these 3 stitches. So we've basically slipped that stitch, but we've slipped it with our working yarn wrapping it from the front. So now we're going to knit these 3, and I choose to knit through the back loop of the first and the third, as I've said many times, like that. So we've knitted those 3, but this one hasn't been knitted. So now what I like to do is I just bring my yarn around to the front so it's out of the way, and we take our left hand needle and we slip it behind, grabbing that stitch, that contrast stitch, because we want to move it over here. Now we just pull out this needle like this, slide it out, slide it back in. Ta-da! And we've moved this stitch from that side round behind to here. And now we're ready to knit it. And we've done that. So that's the CR4 right. I've showed you twice slowly. Now I'm going to show you what it's like fast. I'm going to knit through the back loop. There, that's that one done. And that's that one done. So get going and practice without a cable needle, and then on row 15 I'll show you again how to do a C7B without a cable needle. That's a little harder. I'm showing you again row 15, that's the C7B, but without a cable needle. So that's where the left column is passing over the top of the right column. So we have to start off and knit 6 stitches with our yarn A, which I've done. Okay, so it says C7B, which means that you're going to be putting the first lot of stitches behind. So we take our working yarn, we put it underneath our needle to the front side of the fabric, and we slip the first 4 stitches purlwise onto the right hand needle. So there we've got 3 and 4. And now we're going to wrap those stitches with our working yarn by bringing the yarn across the front and towards the back like that. And we're going to knit these. That's going to bring this over. So we don't knit those 4 stitches, we're going to knit these next. So I knit these 3 stitches, and now I just put my yarn to the front to get it out of the way, and I'm going to pick up that contrast stitch and the 3 cable needles stitches that I didn't knit. See, I've slipped my left hand needle through, and now I'm just simply going to slip my right hand needle out, around to the front and back in those 3, like that, and pull them like this. So there we've got, this column is now knitted and onto the right hand side, which is exactly what we want. Now we want this contrast stitch to be in the middle, and we want it to go around behind those 3 stitches. So we slip those 3 stitches without knitting them onto our right hand needle, and we knit that contrast stitch, and then we're going to slip those 3 cable needles back onto the left like this, and we pull this stitch out and then back in that one that was knitted. So there, all the knitted stitches are now on our right hand needle, and we've got these 3 to knit. Okay, so there we are, we've done that. So you can rewind the video over and over and have a look at that. I'm just going to show you now what it looks like faster, because you might not believe me that it's actually quicker to knit without a cable needle. So I bring it to the front and put the first 4 onto the needle. I bring it to the back. I knit those. I slip those 3 onto the needle. I slip those off and back in. I slip those there. I knit them and back. There, I'm showing off a bit. It's done. Okay, so with a little bit of practice, it's fun. I'm actually going to knit that into the back loop because it's a bit loose looking. And I finish. Okay, so I hope that's inspired you to be a bit of a daredevil and try knitting without a cable needle. At least try to work these without a cable needle until you feel confident, and then you can try row 15. So next off, I'm going to show you row 31 without a cable needle. I'm going to show you now row 31 again, but this time how to cable without using a cable needle. So now we have to maneuver these 7, and the pattern says C7F, which means we're cabling 7 stitches and we're going to move it forward. This panel here is going to move to be over the top of this panel. So these 3 stitches are going to be moved to here. And this middle stitch is going to be moved to the left of these 3 stitches in here. And it's going to sit, so we'll have these 3 stitches, then that stitch, and then those 3 stitches. So that's how we have to maneuver them. So we know that this panel is going to cross over the top. So when I slip them onto my right hand needles without knitting, I leave my working yarn at the back. Okay, with our C7B, that was the cable over here where this panel is going to go to the back. I would have my yarn to the front, slip the stitches, and then put it across like that. But these stitches are going to be at the front. So I leave my working yarn at the back of the work, and I simply slip purlwise my stitches onto my right hand needle. Now we're going to deal with these 4 stitches. So we just forget about those 3 for now, and we know that this contrast stitch has to be moved to the left side of these 3 stitches, and we don't want to move it in front. If we were to move it in front, if I show you, we would see it. It would look like that. So we know it has to be moved behind. Okay, so if it's going to be moved behind, then I move my working yarn to the front, I slip that contrast stitch to the right hand needle, and then I put my working yarn to the back. So that's going to help it move to the back. Okay, now I'm ready to knit these stitches. So I knit those 3 stitches, and I knit a twisted stitch on the first and the third. And now we have to move this stitch, contrast stitch, which we haven't knitted, over here. So I don't put my stitch in the front. If I was to put my stitch in the front, then I would be moving this stitch in front of these. We don't want that. We want this stitch to be moved behind. So that's when I get my left-hand needle and I put it through the back loop. So I said stitch then, but what I meant to say is I don't use my left-hand needle at the front here. I use it at the back to make sure that this stitch will be carried behind. So I'll do it now, like that. Okay, then I just simply take out my stitches, slide them out, and then slide them back in again, like that. Okay, and now I'm ready to knit that stitch. So if we go back and we have a look what we've got our first panel of 3 cabled stitches, and we just slipped those onto the needle. They haven't been knitted yet. And then we took our middle contrast stitch and we manoeuvred it to be the other side of this panel of 3 stitches. And we've knitted all of those 4 stitches. So now we're up to moving these 3 stitches, which haven't yet been knitted, over the top at the front to be here. So I put my left-hand needle at the front of the work, like this, because we're going to move this band on the front. If we were going to move it behind, I would put my left-hand needle behind, slip it in like that. Okay, so I'm going to do it at the front. Now I pull my needle out and then I push it back in again. There we are, and I can move it across like that. So here we have the 3 stitches belonging to this cable. You can see the little bit of light contrast colour. That was the middle stitch that's been knitted, and you can see my yarn is attached to that, and I'm ready now to knit these 3 stitches, which I'll do, twisting the first and the third to keep the cables tight on the outside edges and to make them pop. So there's row 31, cabled without a cable needle. We're ready now to cast off on our scarf. So this is where we started and this is where I'm finishing. Now in the pattern it tells you to cast off after row 14, but I don't want to do that because I like the ending to match the beginning. And so you can see on the beginning we've got these 3 crosses here, and now on the ending I've matched that with 3 crosses. So I've just completed row 24, and I'm ready to cast off in my colour A, which is the dark colour for me. I want these crosses here to match exactly this here. Now here I've got a span of 5 stitches in between, and here I've only got 3 stitches. And if I knit the row 25 using my yarn A in the dark colour, I will then have the same stitch count in between. So these would have widened just a little bit more. So I would have 3 and then I would have 5 in there, 3 and 5 in there, etc., which is closer to how this is. But then if I was to cast off, I would end up having 2 rows of yarn A, which is the dark colour. Okay, and that would not be exactly the same as the 1 cast on row at the beginning. Nevertheless, that's what I'm going to go for. So I now have the wrong side facing me, and I'm going to cast off. Now normally when you cast off in pattern, and that means that you knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches before casting them off. But that gives it a little bit more flexibility. But I don't actually want the end of my scarf to fan out. I don't need that. I want to sort of keep it nice and straight. So I'm just going to cast off by knitting all of the stitches. And it's going fine. So I think it's a good idea. I'm going to knit 2 together in here. I'll probably knit another 2 together, perhaps over here and over here. And that'll just bring it in a little bit so that it stays straight. So there's the end. It's very exciting. You've finished it, and I hope you've learned a lot about cabling with a needle and without a needle. I hope you had a great time making this cabled scarf. Thank you so much for watching this video. And I would love to see some pictures of your finished scarf. So if you would like to post some pictures, you can do so on Ravelry at the Fruity Knitting Podcast group, or on Instagram. You can hashtag me with Fruity Knitting. And if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe for regular knitting podcasts, interviews, and more tutorial videos.